Please can I welcome you to the University of Edinburgh? Can I welcome you to the School of Education? Can I welcome you to the Institute of Sport, Physical Education and Health Sciences? And for those who are joining us on camera from the University of Toronto, a welcome to the University of Toronto. My name is Grant Jarvie. I'm Chair of Sport, Head of the Academy of Sport, and good to see you all here. We also should say that on behalf of this joint lecture, which is held jointly with the School of Literature, Languages and Cultures, up until about 5 minutes ago I was saying to Hugh, Dan, Rob, Fiona and Matt that I was in a minority because I was the only one who was a non-Gaelic speaker in the room at that particular point in time. But it's great that the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures have agreed to host this joint seminar with us. That leaves me to say a few words about Matt, Professor Matthew MacIver CBE, who's here on my left. To many in this room, Matt will need no introduction at all. A well-known public figure in a broad range of communities, both within Scotland and outside of Scotland. Matt and I go back a long, long way, but for the record, Matt, a range of things I could mention: former Chief Executive of the General Teaching Council for Scotland, former Chair of the University of Highlands and Islands in terms of bringing it into being, really important role, and currently on the Committee of Experts of the European Charter for Regional and Minority Languages, and of course an alumni and honorary doctorate of the University of Edinburgh, not to mention CBE. He is of course a native Gaelic speaker and a lifelong Hibs fan, for those of you who want to leave the room now. But it's a great pleasure to have you here, Matt, and Matt's going to talk to us on the role of football in one Western Isles community, for which he has done quite a significant amount of research. And for ourselves, we've been talking quite a bit about how it would be really, really good to do a study on sport in the Western Isles. So maybe we could contribute to that in the discussion afterwards. But Matt, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Grant. I feel that I have to tell you all that Grant Jarvie and I go back to the early 1970s, and we've never, ever lost touch in over 40 years. I'm very pleased to be here today because it gives me an opportunity to talk about my own great love. My own great love is football. Always has been. As a wee boy in Lewis, my brother and I rigged up a set of goalposts on the croft. We lived in a fishing village, so getting a net was no problem. We put up a net as well, and that was my Hampden. That was my Hampden for years, until I left to go to university. And over the years, I have watched football all over the world. I have been in stadiums from the Nou Camp to Wembley, and I have watched some of the greatest footballers who have ever graced the football world. I even actually saw Stanley Matthews in the twilight of his career playing at Tynecastle one day against Hearts. But the more that I followed a sport like football, the more I realized that essentially it wasn't about national and international teams. It wasn't about the big stadia. It wasn't about the big crowds. Football, and probably any other sport, is about the enthusiasts, the people at the people in the community, the people who are developing, the people who are interested, the people who are supporting young people to become involved in a sport. And so my heroes, you know, I actually wrote down, preparing for this, I wrote down the kind of people I saw. I have seen some of the greatest footballers in the world. I once wrote a piece telling who my favourite players were. Nobody agreed with me, and I got abuse for saying that Bobby Moore was the best footballer I'd ever seen. But I have seen some of the greatest footballers in the world. And I have sat for a whole evening with one of my heroes sitting beside me at a dinner table, Dennis Law. And yet my heroes, my boyhood heroes, my football heroes are the players who played for Point football team in the 1950s and the 1960s. This is my world. This is where I come from. I come from a district in Lewis called Point. It's one of the largest districts on the island of Lewis. It's quite a populated part of Lewis. It's almost an island. We take great pride in the fact that once or twice every winter the sea comes along and makes us an island, and we try and proclaim a republic, but up until now it hasn't worked. So that's my world. That's where I come from. That's at the back of my house. My house is the last house in Point, and after that is the sea, the lighthouse, and Cape Wrath. That's my house right at the end there. That's where I was born and brought up. That's where I had my little Hampden to myself. I wanted to show you these because I am not going to show you any photograph of any football team at all. That's not what I want to do. I want to get across the idea of rurality. This is a rural community. This is a community where villages depend very much on each other. This is my village. There are only 18 crofts in that village. That's all. It's a small, tiny village, but it's a very, very tight community. And the district of Point itself is in itself a tight community. And that's what I have always been interested in. Because I was asked 3 years ago to write a history of Point Football Club and to commemorate its 80th anniversary. It was founded in 1934, at the same time as most football clubs in Lewis were founded. We never called it Point Football Club. We never called it the football club. We just called it Point. Now that's quite interesting and it's quite significant because in rural communities, institutions like football teams are actually an integral part of the community. They are important. They are important institutions. They are important to families. They are important to young people, and they're important to the development of rural communities. When I did my research for the book, I began to realize that right from the beginning, there was an awareness within people of their responsibilities to the community. For example, you will not be surprised to know that when the club was set up, the people who were responsible for setting it up were the headmasters. Late 1930s, coming on to the Second World War, headmasters were important people in these communities. When, after the Second World War, when a whole lot of young men came back from the war and began to assume some kind of role in the community, in the 1960s and 1970s, you will see these people beginning to take the role of trying to acquire land for new pitches, for new development, and so on, so that there is a community. There has always been a link with the community. At certain times, the only organisation to be an ambassador for the whole community. I'll come back to that because I think that's really quite important. And this is our football pitch. It's not Hampden. It's not even Easter Road. It's just a football pitch in a rural community in an island off the west coast of Scotland. And yet, it is right at the heart of the community. It is right at the heart of the community. It is important. That's the pitch. And that's the new centre. That's the new centre for the community. That pitch was officially opened in 2007. And what they did, instead of setting up new dressing rooms and so on, they integrated the whole lot into a community centre. There are two interesting things about this. One is that they actually thought in terms of the community rather than in terms of the club. It was going to be part of the community itself. But the second thing that's important about it is they named it in Gaelic. They didn't do it in English. Init Studi simply means Init is the Gaelic word for centre, and Studi is the nickname. We all have nicknames at home in the islands. Studi is the nickname of the best known and probably the best footballer who ever played for the team. So Init Studi is now the centre of the community in terms of the fact that it is the community centre. This is where old age pensioners meet for the lunches. This is where you have presentations. This is where my book, for example, was launched. This is where people now go after funerals. You didn't do that in the islands before now. This is the kind of place they are now catering for weddings. This is the kind of thinking that, and I'm not even going to pretend that Point Football Club is the only club doing that. Not at all. Back Football Club across Broad Bay has built an enormous indoor sports centre for sports like indoor bowling and so on, just beside the football pitch. So it's happening in rural communities. And I'll come back to the political implications of that as well. And I think that there is something really quite important going on here. Remember, many of us, and there are some of us here today, have spent our lives fighting to keep our own language alive. Minority language, tiny, tiny, vulnerable language. And it's really important that organisations like this see the fact that we have not only a different language, but a different culture. That our culture is different, and that within that culture lies a language, a way of life, and a way of thinking that's actually different. And that's why, without any persuasion from anyone, they used Gaelic in the title of the community centre rather than calling it by its English name. And as I said, this is the kind of developments that are happening through the islands. This is the big sports centre in Lewis. I wanted to say a few words about the book what I wrote. What I didn't want to do was to write a book that was just a chronicle. On Tuesday, the 24th of July, we played back and we won 4-1. The teams were blah, 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 scored in the 72nd minute and so on and so on. I didn't want to do that. What I wanted to do was to have a look and see just where an organisation like a football club, where does it fit into the psyche of the islander? Where does it fit into the psyche of the person who lives in a very remote community, the person who lives quite far away from the centres of population, and yet is as interested in a sport as anybody else is, and is as knowledgeable about a sport as anybody else is. But where do they fit into the whole community dynamic? Where, or is there any connection? Is there any dynamic at all? So what I decided to do, rather than just sit down and, well, I actually did read every Stornoway Gazette from 1934 to 2014. There are burdens in life worse than have been a season ticket holder at Easter Road. What I decided to do, I write a monthly column for the local magazine in Point, and I invited everyone. I made up a questionnaire, sent it out, and invited people to send me back their thoughts. And what I got back was enormously interesting, because what I expected was that it would be the former footballers who would send me back the questionnaire, and they would tell about which games they won and which medals they won and so on. Well, that did happen to a certain extent. But what I also got back, there were two categories. One was the proud family, the mother or the father or the grandmother or the grandfather who took great pride in the fact that the son or the grandson had played for the team. and so on. I found that quite fascinating, that there was a thread, a family thread running through the links with a football team. Found that really quite interesting and quite moving. I mean, they were quite moving. And remember, some of these people were not exactly novelists. It was block capitals and so on that came back in the questionnaire. But the second category that I found interesting were the women who responded. And a lot of women, a lot of widows of people who had played, or neighbours of people who had played. And what they mostly sent me were photographs. It wasn't written responses to the questionnaire, it was photographs. Photographs of men or young boys getting ready to go on the bus to go and play. Men coming back from a football game, and the kind of thing. Some of them were quite limited in the kind of information I got from them, but the photographs themselves were supposed to speak to me in terms of what they wanted to say. And the other interesting thing was that a lot of them were in Gaelic. They associated the team with the language, with the culture, and so on. They were different. And what began to build up for me was the idea that there was something quite deep here. There was something quite important going on. It wasn't just another Now, I played for Point Football Club when I was a young man. I wasn't very good, but I played. I found it fascinating to read what my brother had sent in. My brother was a very, very good player, and his two sons were very, very good players. And they've got a house full of medals and cups and so on. And I found it quite moving to see what my brother wrote in, because the whole family thing was so important to him. And the idea that a tradition was being kept and that a link was being kept with an organisation that was important for him. And so when the book was published, it has actually sold hundreds and hundreds of copies. I don't get a penny. All the royalties are going to the club, as you would hope. And the fascinating thing is, not only has it sold within the district, but of course, being from an island, emigrations and so on, it has been sent to Canada. I've had letters from Canada, America, mostly Australia and New Zealand, the old Commonwealth, if you wish, where the book has been sent to. But what was quite interesting at the launch, it wasn't just men who turned up, it was women as well. And that is really important, because what is happening now is that a women's football team is being developed at the same time as a young men's team is being developed at home in Point. And so there's a diversification going on, which is very healthy and very healthy for the community. I wanted to come back to talk about the fact that the football team in this particular part of the Western Isles was more than just an institution. In the early 1960s, the church in Point, the Free Church in Point, an enormous organisation, split. Now, it's not newsworthy to say that a free church has split. I mean, they're still splitting. But in a small community like Point, with 2,000 people, the big church splits, and it split in a way that was bitter and still is bitter. It was a dreadful time for the community, absolutely dreadful. And I say that because my father was one of the leaders of the people who walked out of the original church. It was dreadful, absolutely dreadful. This is the original Free Church in Point. This is the brand new church, Free Church in Point. Same denomination, same church, two enormous churches in the one district. Today, if you go, and I always go because this was my parents' church, you will find no more than 40 people in one and no more than 50 people in another. And the one organisation that kept, I was there, I lived through it, My parents were in the middle of it. The one organisation that kept the community together was the football club. And I wrote that in the book. And it was the first time, I think, that anybody had written about this split quite openly. And you will guess what happened. I got a lovely review in the Daily Record, got a fantastic review in the West Highland Free Press, and in the Stornoway Gazette, the local Free Church minister wrote to tell what, now to be fair to him, it was a very charitable piece he wrote, and he took the view that maybe I might have a little bit of truth in what I was saying. But I found it intriguing that it wasn't a review of a book at all. It was a review of one paragraph of 32,000 words. That was all. But I think this is really quite important, and I think this is the point that I want to get across this afternoon, that this is more than just a football team. It's more than that. These were the kind of things that came from the players and the non-players when I sent out the questionnaires. The first one is from somebody who never played for the team, but who is still involved. It is different to supporting a professional or national team. It is much more about your identity. Regardless of where you are living in later life, and you can sort of see through that. All these people are football people. They know their football. They know their national football. They know their international football. But deep at heart, football for them lies in the local community, lies where it really ought to be at grassroots level, helping young boys to come along and now helping young girls to come along and play. That's the back of my house. I wanted to end up, though, with a few thoughts, because I think there are some really quite serious issues here. First of all, I wanted to raise the issue of the place of sport in our culture. Just have a look at the party manifestos at the moment for the general election. Sport is not exactly one of the main issues in the political world. And in particular, I'm interested in the fact that sport in Scotland and sports development in Scotland is very much like a lot of other developments in Scotland. It is centrally based. It is based on central Scotland. It does not reach into the rural communities. There is no great thinking going on. All these sports centres, community centres, are there because local enthusiasts and local community people and people who care about rural communities have made it so that they happen. They are not there because of any central government policy or even local government policy. Sport in Scotland needs desperately to have some kind of focus in the political world. I worry about it, and I wrote another piece not so long ago that in the Highlands and Islands suddenly we have two football teams, Ross County and Inverness Cally Thistle, who have gained some kind of prominence in the Premier League in Scotland. And they have done nothing to develop or to support young players. Not one single player from the north of Scotland or the islands have made it. Not one. The only one is the Mackay Stephen from Celtic, who made it a few years ago. There's something wrong with that. There's something far wrong with that. And if you transfer that to other sports, just have a look at who's representing Scotland in the Commonwealth Games and the Olympic Games. Have a look at their backgrounds. Have a look at where they're coming from. Have a look to see if they're coming from the state system of education. Most of them aren't. And that really pains me as someone who gave his whole life, his whole professional life, to the state system of education. When I was a head teacher in Edinburgh, I raised over £1 million to build an all-weather pitch at the Royal High School in Barnton. It's wonderful. Every time I fly into Edinburgh, I always ask to sit on the left-hand side of the plane so that I can see this piece of green. It's so green compared to anything else. And I can look down and I can think, that's my only legacy. 12 years at the Royal High, and that's really the only legacy I've left. And on the strength of that, I was awarded a Winston Churchill Travelling Fellowship, which took me to New Zealand to have a look at how New Zealand manages to put together, to knit together the schools and the clubs. I wrote a report about it, went to see the Sports Council, as they were called then, Sports Scotland they're called now, and they weren't interested because they had their own policies. I worry about that. I worry about where we are going in terms of the schools, in terms of policy, in terms of politics. And I worry also about the fact that we spend a huge amount of money on elite sports and elite sports people, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of young people and older people who would love to have this kind of opportunity. Now, I'm speaking from the perspective of a rural community which doesn't get much anyway, and whatever you get, you have to fight really hard to get it. But the good news is that what you learn, I was brought up with football. That's my great love. But it also introduced me to the whole concept of sport and the importance of sport. And so I have travelled internationally and seen wonderful. I have been in Melbourne in 2006, the Commonwealth Games. I walked round Melbourne Cricket Ground the night before the Commonwealth Games were opened. I've seen New Zealand and Australia play against each other in Test cricket in Eden Park in Auckland. The very first time that I ever saw a cricket match was a third Test at Edgbaston between England and the Australians. That was the first time I'd ever seen a cricket game. I've been to Winnipeg to see the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in the Grey Cup final, the equivalent of American Cup. I've travelled all over the world to see sport, because I was brought up with one sport, and that leads you to others. And that's why I worry about where we're going at the moment as a country in terms of aiding and abetting and supporting and developing young people, because we have a bad health problem, and I'm not convinced that we're doing very much about it. So there you are, folks. That's what I wanted to say.
Very good, Matt. Thanks very much. So there's a lot there: sport, community, reality, politics, elite sport, grassroots sport, and the floor is yours in terms of just opening up the discussion, really, which Matt has been a catalyst to. So I want to kick us off. Gavin to the back, and then Rob, and then Gavin, you want to start off? Gavin Reid from the Sports Management section. Just wondering, you talked about football club as the centre. Was it actually the football that was the key thing, or was it actually other non-football factors that were the key thing in that facility, in that club? Was it to do with particular people that were involved in personalities that were driving it, rather than it was football? That's a good question. My own view is that it was probably a mixture of personalities who were community-minded anyway, and quite far-seeing. Remember, I was talking about the head teachers and the new people. Well, when they decided to buy land or to get land from the trust to build the new pitch, they deliberately built it literally in the centre of the district. It's literally, Rob knows the area well, and he'll know exactly what I mean. It's in the middle of Point. It's right in the middle of Point. It couldn't be better situated for a lot of people. Remember, a lot of people don't have cars, and so that's a very good question. It's a mixture of everything. But what
didn't want to forget, and what came through the questionnaires was this great love for the club. And how do you assess that? I don't know. But my suspicion is that you're right. It was personalities. I could even name you them. You know, the personalities who were involved, and a bit of vision as well as to where to choose, where to actually situate a new football club and a new football pitch and so on. Good question.
First of all, thanks very much for the presentation. My wife's mother is from Point. My wife spent her early years in Point, so I think she's related to the Studies, so they're very proud of the Studi name on the centre. Two questions, one lighthearted, how did you become a Hibs fan? And then the second question, because I can't think of too many Hibs fans in Lewis, was it after you came? And then the second question was about your trip to New Zealand, and particularly the links between school and then sort of community sports organizations. Coming from Canada as I do, ice hockey is the big sport there. And it was funny, at least in Toronto where I grew up, there was no link at all between school and ice hockey. All the clubs were separate organizations. We didn't even have a school team, despite the fact that most of the kids and a lot of the young women as well played organized ice hockey. It was done in school. We had Canadian football and everything else, but the links weren't necessarily there. Very interesting to hear about the New Zealand model, and it certainly produced not only a lot of community involvement, but elite athletes as well.
I have to stand up to tell you about my story. I just have to. I arrived to come to this university, Edinburgh University, on a Saturday night, October 1964. I was a walking encyclopedia on football. I'd never seen a professional football match in my life, never seen a train, never seen a street light, never seen a shop light. I arrived and my uncle met me. We had no television or anything like that. My uncle met me at Waverley Station on a Saturday night, and I had to matriculate on Monday, or the week beginning that Monday. I had no idea what the word matriculate meant. He took me up on the number 7 bus to Chambers Street and showed me where Adam House was. I went into Adam House, and I said to him on the bus going up, I said, you realise that there's a big game at Easter Road on Wednesday. Hibs were playing the great Real Madrid team, the wonderful, wonderful Santa Maria, Gento, Puskas, Di Stefano, the lot. They were playing on the Wednesday night against Real Madrid. So I said to my uncle, how do I get to... Oh, he said, don't worry. He said, it's an all-ticket game. I had no idea what that meant. So when I got out of Adam House, I met a woman on the road. And I said, how do I get to Easter Road? And she said, you have to take a number 1 bus. So I said, where do I get a number 1 bus? So she showed me. The bus driver let me off, and remember this is 1964. Big green wooden gate at Easter Road, open. I walked in. A wooden door, open. I walked in. There was a big wooden sign, manager's office, with an arrow on it, going up. So I walked up the stairs, and there was a door, the manager. I knocked at the door, and the man said, come in. And there was Jock Steen. He was the Hibs manager. So he said, sit down, son. So I sat down, and I told him my story. And he opened the drawer, and he took out a ticket, and he said, hey, you are, son. He said, I'm giving you this ticket for Wednesday on one condition. As long as you stay in Edinburgh, you'll support the High Bees. And I've done that. I told that story on BBC Radio in Yale, and I've since written about it. You couldn't make it up. You just couldn't. It was total innocence, utter, complete innocence. Now to get on to your serious question. I'll tell you the two sports that interested me in New Zealand, where they were trying to set up a system so that young boys would take up rugby league. Remember, the great tradition is the All Blacks, rugby union, and cricket. And they were trying to break that whole grip that rugby union and cricket had, and so on. So they were trying to build up this rugby, which, as you know now, I think they're the world champions, or they're not far off it. And what they were doing was getting the clubs into the schools at rugby league and getting them. Now, I was interested in that because, remember, I was a head teacher after the teacher strikes in Scotland, where the whole thing of pupils and so on fell apart. And the other sport I was interested in was netball. They wanted to bring up or to develop a whole class of world-class netball players among the girls. And they were targeting the elite schools that had the rugby players. Auckland Grammar, for example, Otago High School down in South Island and so on. And I was fascinated at the work that they were doing, and I was also fascinated at how tolerant the clubs were in terms of the schools. We don't have that kind of relationship in Scotland. I know because I used to run schoolboys football myself for 13 years, and the boys' clubs are not exactly the greatest friends of schools. So what I was trying to argue when I came back was that there should be some kind of discussion between the schools and the clubs to bring about something. I'm sure the Sport Scotland has its own particular policies and so on, but my goodness, for a country of under 4 million people, New Zealand doesn't do badly either in rugby or in cricket or in rugby union or in netball. And one of the reasons for that is that they have an infrastructure which is based on the schools and the clubs. Yeah. Mind you, they're no good at football.
Because in my area, in sport and performance psychology, I know of research that was commissioned by the Scottish Government, which people refer to a kind of vacuum in this area of talent development. And it was really just to get your thoughts on why people pay for research, pay for expertise, and then don't do anything with it.
From the football point of view, I'm absolutely convinced that one of the reasons that we have declined dramatically in terms of football is the fact that you're right, there is no integral infrastructure that looks at young talent and brings it through, and there is the temptation, because of money coming in from television, to get cheap. You shouldn't talk of human beings as cheap inputs, but you know exactly what I'm trying to say. I watched Celtic at Easter Road last year, the wealthiest football team in Scotland, and my goodness, they are wealthy. They are seriously wealthy. And there were 2 players who were Scottish in that team. But that's not the point that I want to make. Both of them, Scott Brown and Charlie Mulgrew, had been brought up by other clubs. They had not come through an academy or whatever you want to call it, a nurturing development and so on. You can see the same thing happening in rugby. I have no great knowledge of rugby. All I know is that I was the headmaster of quite a famous rugby playing school, the Royal High School. We built a rugby clubhouse on the grounds of the school. The game has gone professional. The Royal High School club is no more. It amalgamated with Corstorphine, I think. It's great for dinners and it's great for social occasions and so on. But the young talent that came through, and it's just not there. I desperately worry about it. My namesake, my nephew, is the sports coordinator in Highland Region, for example. He is desperately unhappy at the kind of thing that's going on at the moment. He thinks that it's absolutely ironic that more young boys are being developed at a club like Brora Rangers than are being developed by Ross County and Inverness Cally Thistle. And you have a look at the players who are playing for Ross County and Inverness Cally Thistle, and you know exactly what I mean by the fact that they are bypassing all the young people. And it has to change. We have to change it as a country. I don't know, some of you people will be probably quite influential people, and some of you will go on to roles in society which can change things. I do worry about it. I do worry that we aren't giving young people enough opportunities. And I do worry as well that my daughter, for example, is married in Rothinorman, which is just beside Inverurie, and Hannah Miley is the big star in Inverurie, the swimmer, and she's coached by her father. Were it not for her father, she would not be at the level that she is. Now, God bless him, that's not what I mean, but there must be, or there should be, some structure that takes that kind of talent and uses it, and not just use that particular talent, but gets more of them together to be able to develop something. And Inverurie, and where my daughter lives, is very, very rural, hugely rural, and it's still depending on the enthusiast and the person who's pushing.
I want to chip in. What's left? Matt. Sorry. No, you go.
Can I lob just a couple of quick questions or maybe comments, and you can roll them all into one. One, I was interested in just the significance of 34. My understanding of it was that there was really no football in the Western Isles until the boys came back from the war. So, around about 1920 would have been the time football generally took hold in the Western Isles, and to a large extent that wiped out whatever shinty was being played in the Western Isles at that point. I'm interested in the gap between then and 34. Just a slightly off the wall question, did they play in Gaelic? Presumably they did in that community. What would happen if a set of rugby posts were put up at that particular pitch? Because there has been a huge cultural shift in the Western Isles anyway, and there are other sports. And two final points. Your analysis of people not making the breakthrough. It was interesting that one of the people who did make the breakthrough in senior football from the Western Isles was Colin Campbell, who made it big with Hibs, or relatively big anyway. He was at school with me in Mohaba. And I think that's one of the points, is that the school system is really what broke down. I started teaching in 81 in the middle of the strike, and it never recovered because we never went to do any more extracurricular activities, and that's put the onus on the organising, the governing bodies, and I don't think they're anywhere near as effective as the actual schools were. So there was an issue there, but there are glimmers of hope. The Island Games, for example, is now providing a huge opportunity for people in the Western Isles to make an advance in terms of athletic achievements. You have people like Beth McLeod play rugby for Scotland, although she had to go to a private school to qualify, whatever, there was a message there. So there are some hopeful things. I'm not so sure I agree with your analysis about Inverness, Cali Thistle. Just for the simple fact that Nick Ross, for example, came through their system, now plays with Dundee. Ryan Christie came through their system and plays, sort of plays for Celtic, but will probably never play for Celtic. So, the Highlands has punched above its weight in many respects in terms of football already. But again, it was before all this school breakdown happened.
Right.
Not so sure there was a question.
Just to come back to Colin Campbell, I reckon that there are only four island boys who have played professional football since the Second World War. Colin Campbell, Alistair Morrison, Studi, and Billy Urquhart. I can't think of any others. Really interesting question about why in the 1930s. There was football. Football was set up in Stornoway, the town of Stornoway, just after the SFA was set up in the late 19th century. So there were teams in Stornoway. But what happened after the First World War, that Lewis lost over 2,000 men, young men, in the war. And those who survived came back, and the emigrations from 1919 to 1925 are utterly different from the emigrations of the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was families that went to Canada. And from 1919 to 1925, it's young men who go. So there is a gap, an age gap in Lewis in the whole of the 1920s. And it is only in 1933 that you get the first village teams being set up in Lewis, rural Lewis. And in 1934, a cup is set up, the Ilan Elanry Cup. And that's when most of them. My interpretation of that is that there weren't enough young men to sustain the whole thing. As far as I think you're right about the island games, and one of the things that's hugely encouraging for people like me and for you is that the best sports programme going out on BBC Scotland is in Gaelic. It goes out every Saturday morning. It is utterly diversified. It caters for almost every sport that's been done in Scotland, for all minority sports and especially for women's sports. Wonderful programmes, just been awarded an award. And I think that with that kind of backing and the games, the island games and so on, there is hope in the future that we can. But my main point is that is coming from the communities. My main point is that there isn't an overall central policy in terms of sport, and you can see it in the party manifestos. As far as Inverness Callie-Thistle is concerned, and I'm very fond of Inverness Callie-Thistle. I used to live in Inverness. I came up for their very first game. They played against Arbroath, and I came up from Edinburgh to see it. Against Arbroath, they played at the Clachnacudden ground. I went there. We used to live in Inverness in Broadstone Park, and the King's Mills was literally in our back garden. I'm still convinced, though, that there's something wrong when you've got young talent in the north of Scotland, the very north, in Shetland, in Orkney, in Skye, the Inner Hebrides, the Outer Hebrides, young lads, and not one single one of them, not one is being developed. I think that there is a real issue there.
A challenge and a half. If we've got a couple of minutes, let's go back to just take chairs probably for a couple of seconds and then thanks for that. One of the things that's common, I'm wondering whether, let's just say, the community and the points and football, and I'm not actually sure if it is a plea for help, because you're not actually asking for help.
No.
It's you wouldn't. The question at the back of my mind is: would you want the system to step in? So we point in today's terms, we want to be a community sports hub, a sports Scotland. Crawling all over it? I don't know. That's a question. But it would be a mechanism of getting resources into the islands. But I've heard this happen a couple of times. I heard this conversation a couple of times about the success of the New Zealand community sports system and the criticism of the Scottish community sports system. And what was put to me was the New Zealand Maori culture penetrates that sports system. This is not in terms of elite sport or anything, but what it was about was there was not ever a second doubt about the obligation or the duty to volunteer, and that volunteering just happened. And New Zealand sports culture, because of the influx of Maori culture, had a strong moral obligation imbued within the genes almost around about volunteering. And volunteering and keeping your feet on the ground and not shouting too high about how good you are. And I'm just wondering if you recognise any of these observations within an island culture. Volunteering, feet on the ground.
Yes, I'm not silly enough not to understand the points that have been made, and of course I exaggerate some of the points simply to make the point. I do believe, though, that rural communities could do with some central support. I take the point about the enthusiasts and so on. Of course I do. But I do feel that there does need to be some kind of coordinated policy in in the country, and I do worry about sport in Scotland. I do worry about sport in Scotland. As far as the Moray is concerned, you can see the, as they call them in New Zealand, the islands. You can see the influence of the culture of the islands in some of the schools. I have visited, for example, Auckland Grammar School now 5-6 times, and you can see the whole Otago High School in the South Island is the same, a hotbed of the whole culture of achievement and so on. I don't think we have that in Scotland, but I do think that with a little bit of encouragement and with a little bit of success, we could do quite well. We had, for example, a girl from South Hughes, Kerry McPhee, in the Commonwealth Games in mountain biking, and that's been a tremendous fillip, and my argument is that to get these ambassadors, to get these role models, we need a wee bit of help. That's really all I'm saying.
We've run out of time, I think. So, unless there's any last question, I'm not going to be around for a while if people want to just talk to them individually. But just on behalf of Rob's school, behalf of our school, thank you very much for coming to the seminar. It's the last seminar in the SAFE for this year. We have a new programme for next year. But above all, can I just say on your behalf, thank you very much for Matt for stimulating a conversation this afternoon.
Thank you. You can order the book, by the way, from MacIver Publishing. A bargain at $9.99. Every book you buy, £1 goes to the local football team, the best football team in the world except for Hibs. So